Granddad's nighttime visits started when I was 13 years old. This was a few years ago now, but it only stopped fairly recently. And I still remember the first time it happened. It was the middle of the school holidays, and my mum was ill. Mum being ill wasn't something that bothered me too much at the time. It was a pretty common occurrence, something I was even used to by then. Every month it would happen the same way. Dad would come to my room and tell me Mum wasn't feeling so good and that she'd have to go away for a while until she felt better. Then he'd drive off with her in his car and collect her a few days later. I never knew where she went. Never knew what was wrong with her either. Sometimes she'd come home with scratches up her arms, but apart from that I never saw any other symptoms. When Dad went off to collect her, I'd wait by the door for them to come back. I'd wait for her to reappear and scoop me up into her arms. "I missed you, Cubby," she'd always say, planting kisses over my face. "I love you so, so much." My name's James, but as long as I can remember, Mum's called me Cubby. It's her nickname for me. Every month, the same routine. Mum getting ill, going away for a bit, then coming back as if nothing was wrong. But the summer I turned 13, things changed. The routine changed, because that was the first time I started going to stay at Granddad's. My granddad's a large man with a white beard and a shaved head. He's from Sheffield originally, and he still has this deep, gruff northern accent. Communicates mainly in grunts. Lives on his own on the edge of the New Forest in an old ramshackle cottage. We hardly ever saw him when I was little, and when we did I always dreaded the visits. He scared me. I wasn't scared of him by the time I was 13, though, or at least that's what I told myself. No, the reason I protested when Dad told me I'd be staying with Granddad this time, while Mum got better, was because I didn't want to leave the house. I wanted to stay near my friends. The kids I knew in the village would be out climbing trees and going on bike rides. If I was cooped up in Granddad's cottage, I'd be missing out. Dad was having none of it, though. He wouldn't give me a reason why I had to go, or respond to my protests. Just told me it would be good for me to spend time with Granddad. Then he bundled me into the car and we left. 45 minutes later, I was standing on the doorstep of Granddad's cottage, raising my hand to knock. Dad had already driven off. I was trying to tell myself I wasn't a little kid anymore, and there was nothing to be scared of. But as the cottage door creaked open and Granddad's large shadow fell over me, I couldn't stop my heart from beating a little harder in chest. Granddad's cottage was old. The ceilings were low, and the furniture was minimal. The carpets were moth-eaten, ancient things that seemed to kick up tiny clouds of dust whenever you put a foot on them. The bathroom had black mold rising up the wallpaper. The paper itself was damp and flaking and had peeled away to the stone in some areas. Entering the room felt like stepping into a cave. My bedroom wasn't much better. It was right at the back of the house, and it had only 3 pieces of furniture: an oak chest of drawers, a dilapidated wardrobe, and a single bed in the corner. I remember my heart sinking the minute I set eyes on it. Oddly, even though I can picture Granddad's house clearly enough, I don't remember much about how I spent my days there. Especially during that first visit. I think we mainly kept out of each other's way. Granddad would be in the lounge watching TV or reading, and I'd be in my room on my phone, making the most of the 1 bar of 4G I could find in the cottage. I can't remember if we spoke to each other much, or what we said if we did. Mostly it's a blur. What I do remember are the nights, the first night in particular. I told Granddad I was tired, and that I was going to head to bed early. He grunted something in response. Then I spent a bit of time in my room on Snapchat and YouTube, the videos taking painfully long to load, before heading to sleep. I woke sometime in the night. The cottage was silent around me. I could hear the leaves of the birch tree rustling in the wind in the back garden, but that was all. Moonlight spilled through a gap in the curtains. I leaned over to check my phone and saw that the time was a little after 2 a.m. For some reason, I felt wide awake. My heart was beating hard in my chest and a film of sweat coated my forehead, as if I'd woken suddenly from a nightmare. But if I had, I couldn't remember it. I tried to relax, tried to lie back and let sleep wash over me again. But in Granddad's cottage, relaxing wasn't an easy thing to do. At first, I'd only been able to hear the tree outside the window, but as I lay there on the pillow, staring into the darkness, I began to hear other noises too. The soft creak of a floorboard, faint taps, a distant rattling, which I assumed had to be pipes in the wall, and other sounds as well. Sounds I found it harder to place. At one point, I heard something that sounded like a faint snuffling noise coming from the back garden, some kind of animal. But when I sat up in bed and strained my ears, all I could hear was the wind. Get a fucking grip, I told myself. You're 13 years old, not a little kid anymore. It was easier said than done, but I managed it eventually. I don't know how long I lay in the dark for, but after a while, tiredness finally got the better of me. My mind began to settle. I felt myself slowly drifting off, only to jerk suddenly awake again when I heard a noise outside my room. A soft, deliberate creak, loud and clear in the darkness. I turned over in bed, trying not to make a sound. My heart hammered in my chest. I pulled the covers down from my face slightly, positioning myself so I could peek over them, so I could see the bedroom door. And as I stared at it, feeling like I was 5 years old again, I saw the handle begin to turn. I squinted my eyes shut. I don't know what thought was going through my mind, but right then I reverted to an age-old tactic, pretending to be asleep. Playing dead. I could still see through a crack in my eyelids, but now the room was blurry as well as dark. I lay as still as possible, trying to keep my breathing normal. For a few seconds, nothing happened. There were no more sounds. And then, just as I was beginning to think I might have imagined it after all, the door swung inwards. Granddad stood in the frame. I couldn't make out his face, but I recognized his towering bulk. He was standing completely still, filling the doorway top to bottom, breathing heavily in the silence. He's just checking on you, I told myself. He's come to check that you're okay, that's all. But even as the thought went through my head, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. I saw something that made me suck in a sharp breathe and tense my entire body below the covers. The shape of Granddad's head was wrong. It was all wrong. Even in the blurry shadows, the wrongness was unmistakable. His silhouette bulged out in strange places, bulking out around the lower half of his face in a way I couldn't understand. I opened my eyes another fraction of an inch, unable to help myself, and what I saw did nothing to quiet the fear swirling in my chest. Granddad was wearing a mask, a black mask. It covered the lower half of his face, allowing space at the top for his eyes to peer over at me. The mask covered his mouth and nose with multiple straps on each side stretching around his cheeks to the back of his head. It looked like one of those pollution masks people sometimes wore in big cities. I snapped my eyes fully shut, forced myself to breathe in, then out, then in again, nice and slow. I kept my ears strained for the sound of Granddad's feet on my bedroom floor, but it never came. After a while later, I heard the soft squeak of the door shutting and his footsteps receding down the hall. We never spoke about him coming into my room. I never mentioned it to Granddad, and he never said anything about it to me. I never told anyone else either. I thought about telling Mom or Dad after that first visit, but in the end, I kept quiet. Partly because I was so happy to be home again, I think, but mostly because the memory had taken on a strange quality by that point. It was like an old, half-forgotten nightmare. I could still picture it, but the fear I'd felt at the time had faded. It was as though the whole thing had happened to someone else. The feeling didn't last, though. Next month, Mum got ill again, and I was packed back off to Granddad's cottage. I protested harder that time, but Dad still wouldn't bend. He just told me to stop being selfish and to give my mum some space, so she could get better, wouldn't look at me as he said it. And once again, when I stayed at Granddad's cottage, he came to my room, stood in the shadows of the doorway, the same black mask on his face. He never touched me or anything. I don't want you to think that. This isn't that kind of story. He simply stood on the threshold of my room, on the edge of the moonlight, staring in at me. Then after a while, he'd leave again. The ritual happened every time I visited. It's been happening each month for the past 3 years. And it was only yesterday that I finally learned the truth. Only yesterday when all the pieces clicked into place at last. Around my 16th birthday, I began to get ill. Weak and tired with no energy. Hungry all the time. I got this prickly rash on my body too, and my muscles and bones constantly seemed to ache. It was summer, so there was no school, and I stayed in bed all day, falling in and out of a broken sleep, dreaming. The dreams were vivid and strange. In them it was nighttime, and I was running, sprinting through the woods as fast as I could, faster than I'd ever gone before in my life. The moon hung overhead in a purple-black sky, framing me like a spotlight, and at the end of each dream, I'd stumble out into a clearing. I'd see Granddad's cottage, and just as his front door began to creak open, I'd wake up in a cold sweat. Yesterday evening, Dad visited me in my room, came and sat beside my bed. He told me that Mum was ill too, and that he'd have to take her away for a few days. Told me to get lots of rest. But when I asked him what time he'd be coming home, he told me he wouldn't. Not for a few days anyway. He said he'd be back when Mum was better, and in the meantime, Granddad was going to come round and look after me. That was when I finally lost it. I was too ill to get properly angry at him, but I did my best. Screamed and yelled. Told him I didn't fucking want Granddad to come and stay with me. I wanted him and Mum. Accused him of abandoning me. Said I hated him. He just sat on the chair beside my bed and took it. Listened to me without saying anything. The guy looked more tired and old in that moment than I'd ever seen him look before in my life. And when I was finally finished, when my throat was so raw I couldn't yell anymore, he said something to me, something that started a conversation I'll never forget. I know you don't understand why I'm doing this right now, but you will soon. Granddad will explain everything. I sighed and lay back against my pillow, exhausted. I don't fucking want Granddad to explain anything, Dad. I want you here. I know you do, James, but I can't stay here. Not right now. It's not safe for me. I opened my eyes fully and stared at him, suddenly alarmed. What do you mean it's not safe? Am I contagious or something? No. He shook his head. It's nothing like that. It's just that at certain times of the month, I have to. He sighed again and looked back down at me. Shook his head once more. It really is best if your grandfather explains all this, James. Your mother can help too when she's back. I might know more about it than most, but I don't really know. Not like them. I had the urge, almost overwhelming, to reach out and shake him. I didn't understand anything he was saying. What do they need to explain? I said. Can you please just tell me what the fuck's going on? My dad sighed again. He stood up and walked over to my bedroom window, then peered out through the curtains. Big moon up there tonight, he said after a moment. Not even dark out and I can already see it. He stared through the glass for a while, then turned back again, turned to face me. James, you know how your mum gets poorly each month, he said. How she has to go away for a while until she's better? I nodded. Of course I knew. Okay, well, the reason she has to go away is because she has this rare condition. It only flares up every once in a while, and it's easy enough to predict when it's going to happen. But that's the only thing about it you can predict. At her age, they can get, well, your mother finds it hard to do certain things, I suppose. She finds it hard to act in a certain way. What condition does she have? Your granddad will explain that better than me. Why will he explain? Why can't you just fucking tell me? Because he has it too. I don't understand why you can't. I paused, suddenly processing what my dad had just said. Wait, did you say Granddad has it? Dad nodded. After a moment, he sat down on the end of my bed, ran a hand through his hair. It's genetic, James. Granddad has it, and your mum has it, and you have it as well. I stared at him, unsure I'd heard him correctly. I have. Yes, you do. It's not a bad condition exactly, but it's something that has to be managed carefully. Your granddad has lived with it for a long time, and he knows all about it. He'll be able to help you. Blood was pounding in my ears. Thoughts and memories were suddenly pressing at the edges of my mind like angry dogs. I pushed them away and focused on Dad. Is that why you started sending me to his house every month? So I got to know him better? So he could fucking help me with whatever the fuck this is I've got? Dad stared at me with sadness in his eyes. It wasn't my idea, he said after a moment. Your mother said it was best. Granddad agreed with her. When you're coming of age, it's good if you can spend time with older ones of their, well, like I said, your granddad can explain it. I bit back another urge to scream at him. I still didn't really understand what the hell he was talking about, or at least the main part of my mind didn't understand. At the same time, though, something was starting to nag at me. Images and memories circled the outskirts of my brain, just out of sight. Monsters around a campfire. I swallowed. "You said it wasn't safe for you," I said after a moment. "When Mum gets ill, you said you can't be around her." Dad paused, then nodded his head. "And what about Granddad? Are you safe around him?" Dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. He frowned. "Your grandfather's better at dealing with his symptoms," he said eventually. "He's had longer to get used to them than your mother has. But no, I still wouldn't be safe. Not completely." "So why was I safe?" I exploded. "Why did you ship me off to stay with him every month? Is that why I've caught this fucking thing?" No. I told you, it's genetic. You were born with it. And besides, your grandfather would never hurt you. We took extra precautions on the worst nights, too. I insisted on it. We made sure you'd never—" But my dad's voice was suddenly growing distant. The things circling my mind had grown close enough for me to see them at last. They came out of the shadows and were lit up by the flames. Exposed. A barrage of images and memories flew through my head in a blur. I remembered the times Mum had come home with scratches up her arms. I remembered the dream I'd had where I was running through the woods. I remembered Granddad standing in my bedroom doorway in the cottage, the black mask covering his face. And in that moment, I realized something I'd never understood before. Something that filled me with a sickening combination of terror and excitement. The thing on Granddad's face hadn't been a mask after all. It was a muzzle. "Don't let me catch you talking about werewolves." Granddad sat down on the edge of my bed. The mattress sagged beneath his weight. "This isn't a bloody storybook." It'd been several hours since Dad had left with Mum. I'd been sat up in my bed, watching the sky outside my window fade to black, watching as the glow from the moon grew brighter. When Granddad finally arrived half an hour ago, the headlights from his Land Rover spilling into our driveway, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear, the same way I'd felt when I was speaking to Dad earlier. In the time Granddad had been in my room, I'd already asked him what felt like 100 different questions, and we'd barely even scratched the surface. "So, you're not a werewolf, then?" I forced myself to meet Granddad's gaze. His blue eyes stared back at me, bright and unblinking. After a moment, he looked away and sighed. "It's not a word anyone uses," he muttered. "I suppose there are similarities to what you're thinking of, but it's different too, not like in films. But whatever happens to us, it happens when the moon's full, right?" "Well, yes and no. Not exactly. Granddad frowned and paused for a moment. He stared down at my duvet, as if he could find an answer in it. Then he let out a sudden, throaty chuckle, grinned and shook his head. "I went through all this with your mother, but I'm still no good at explaining it. It's like falling asleep in a way, moving between awake and sleeping, between different states. You can do it any time you want, but it'll happen quicker if you're already tired. And if you're really tired, it's hard to avoid." I stared at Granddad, tried to understand what he meant. He must have seen the confusion in my face. "Sorry, lad, I'm not explaining myself well at all. What I mean is, we can change any time we want. Older ones who've lived with it for years can change in a matter of minutes. But there are times of the month, when the moon's at its fullest, when changing is a lot easier. Like how sleep comes easier when you're tired. And on the night it's completely full, the change can be, well, it can be almost impossible to control, even when you're as old as I am." He smiled at me, but I didn't smile back. I was trying to concentrate on everything he'd been saying, trying to take it all in. Questions were building in my head, and I didn't know which to ask first. "So when you do change," I said after a moment, "when we change, what do we change into? What does it look like?" Granddad stared back at me. He was silent for a few moments before he opened his mouth to speak. "Well, His sentence was cut off by the sound of a car passing on the road outside. Headlights flared in the darkness outside my window, then faded again. The noise of an engine briefly filled the room, dwindling as the car drove off into the distance. When I looked back at Granddad, I saw he was on his feet. He marched over to the window and frowned out into the darkness. "I knew we should have done this at the cottage." He muttered the words under his breath, but they were just loud enough for me to hear. Stupid of me, coming here. Granddad? Eh! What do you mean, stupid? Why is it stupid? Granddad glanced back at me. Thick frown lines traced his forehead. It's nothing you need to worry about. I wanted your dad to bring you to my cottage, that's all, but the stubborn bastard wouldn't do it. Said you were too ill. What's wrong with you coming here? It's risky, that's what. Any trace of a smile had gone from Granddad's face. If you're going to learn about all this, you might as well learn that first. It's a risk. All of it. A constant struggle to stay hidden. And you don't get to be my age without making a few enemies, I'll tell you that. I stared past Granddad at the darkness beyond my bedroom window, stared at the light of the moon. My body still ached, but for now a spike of adrenaline had made me forget the worst of it. I suddenly realized I'd never seen Granddad outside his cottage before. What enemies? I said after a moment. Are there people after you? Granddad let out another low chuckle. This time there was no humor in it. Not just me, he said, the whole clan. There's always someone. Hunters out for a trophy, big companies, people wanting your skin, the government. We try our best to keep everything secret, but it's no good. People see things, and people talk. It always gets out. Granddad reached out suddenly and tugged the curtains across my window shut, blocked out the moonlight. He stood at the end of my bed, staring down at me. If we're going to talk, we'll do it downstairs, he growled. I'm not standing here like your bloody nursemaid. He turned and left the room before I had a chance to respond. We sat in the lounge, opposite one another. Granddad in an armchair near the front door, me on the sofa, curtains drawn, yellow light spilled down from the bulb overhead. A light rain had started outside, and it drummed against the window like 1,000 soft fingers. Every now and then a car would pass by on the road, and each time Granddad's body would tense. Just a little. He'd try and hide it, but I saw. I still felt ill. My body ached, and my skin itched. I felt weak and tired. But for now, at least, I could almost forget about those things. Adrenaline, fear, and excitement swirled in my stomach. I wanted to ask Granddad about his mask and why he wasn't wearing it, but I was worried he'd get angry again, like he had in my room. I'd heard the temper in his voice then, and I didn't want to be on the receiving end of it. So instead, I asked a different question. Where does Mum go? I said, when she's away each month, I mean. Where is she? She stays with a couple of friends of mine, said Granddad. Old friends, part of the clan. They live in the New Forest, too, about 5 miles from me. They've helped me with her, helped me show her the ropes. But why does she have to stay away? Why can't she do what you do? Granddad fixed his blue eyes on mine, ran a hand through his thick white beard, scratching the skin underneath. It takes a long time to get used to the change, he said after a moment. I've lived with it for years, and even then your dad still wanted me to put that chuffin' thing on my face when I was around you. Block out the smell on the worst nights. Granddad shook his head. I didn't need it, and it pissed me off that he thought I might, but I let it go. I let it go because he's seen your mother when she's in her other state, and he knows how bad it can get. How bad can it get? Granddad opened his mouth to reply, but at that moment another car engine sounded in the distance. He paused, listening. The engine grew louder. After a few moments I saw headlights illuminate the drawn curtains of the lounge window. The engine swelled as the car drove past the house. I heard the splash of wheels on wet tarmac. The engine faded as the car continued down the road, and then it suddenly cut off. Granddad froze. His face was set in a mask of concentration. After a moment, he cocked his head slightly to one side, presumably listening for the sound of the engine starting back up again. It didn't come. I listened too, and I couldn't hear a thing. Only the rain growing steadily heavier outside, pattering against the glass. Wind gusted around the house, causing the trees in our garden to rustle. It's probably just one of our neighbors, Granddad, I said. I think the car. I stopped talking when Granddad held up a hand. He shook his head. The frown lines on his forehead were so deep now they looked like cuts. No, he muttered after a moment. Someone's coming. My skin suddenly felt cold. I had no reason to be afraid, but the tension on Granddad's face was rubbing off on me. I strained my ears for a sound, but I still couldn't hear anything. Only the rain. Granddad's, it's nothing, I whispered. There's nobody out. Our garden gate creaked open. The sound was soft but clear, the familiar squeal of old hinges. It cut through the wind and rain. My skin prickled with an unpleasant heat and my heartbeat picked up in my chest. Granddad was on his feet. He crept over to the little front door in the corner of our lounge, moving without making a sound. Our house is tidier than Granddad's cottage, but it's still almost as old. The ceilings are low. Standing just to the left of the front door, in the shadowy entrance to our dining room, Granddad had to crouch. Stood up straight, the top of his head would have touched the ceiling. The front door was smaller than he was. His blue eyes were fixed on the little square of frosted glass set in its center. I started to get up from the sofa, but he held out his hand again, motioned for me to stay where I was. A second later, I heard footsteps crunching across our gravel drive. I held my breath. Every inch of my skin prickled and itched. I stared at the little window in our front door, waiting to see movement on the far side of it, trying to tell myself I had nothing to be afraid of. It was probably just Dad, that was all. Dad, coming back to pick something up, maybe something he'd forgotten. It was a little strange that he hadn't parked the car right outside our house, but there had to be an explanation for that, didn't there? Who else would it be? As these thoughts rushed through my head, a shadow appeared on the far side of the frosted glass, a shape in the darkness. I held my breath again, feeling my heart pound my rib cage like a fist. For a second, nothing happened, and then someone was rapping their fist against the front door over and over again. "Hello? Is anyone home?" It was a man's voice, not someone I recognized. "Hello? Can anyone help me, please?" I saw a light on. Granddad stayed completely still. He stared at the door, his face unchanging. The knocking continued. After a moment, the man spoke again. His voice sounded close to panic. "Please, if someone's there, can I use your phone? Our car's broken down and we don't have any signal. Please, me wife isn't very well." Granddad hesitated for another second. Then he reached out and tugged the door open. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see the man in the porch, but I could hear everything he was saying clearly enough. "Oh, thank you so much. I'm so sorry to trouble you. We've had an absolute nightmare. Our car's broken down just a little way along the road, and my wife is unwell. She's 8 months pregnant, you see, and we're on our way to Bournemouth to visit friends. But my phone lost signal, and I was taking what I thought was a shortcut. Stupid of me, I know. And then we got this warning light on the dashboard a little while back, and I watched Granddad's face as the man babbled on and on. His expression was fixed and hard to read, but I thought at least some of the tension had gone out of it. "So if you have a mobile I could use or a landline," the man continued, "then I can make a very quick call to the AA and I'll be out of your hair. I'm so sorry again for the intrusion." "What's that in your hand?" Granddad's gruff voice cut through the man's rambling. I stared at his face, but his expression remained the same. "Oh, this is a walkie-talkie," said the man. "I may not be able to navigate to save my life, but I always worry about safety. Over-worry, actually. Paranoid, that's what my wife calls me. We ran out of petrol in the middle of nowhere once, and I've carried a pair of these in the car ever since, along with a first aid kit and some spare clothes. Just in case, you know. You never know when these things might come in handy. In fact, that reminds me." He fell silent for a moment. A few seconds later, I heard a soft beeping sound. "Hi, sweetheart, it's me," he said. "A nice gentleman down the road has just opened the door, so I'll call the AA and be back as soon as possible. Okay? Over." There was a faint cracking noise. After a moment, I heard the tinny sound of a woman's voice responding. "Okay, be as quick as you can," she said. "I'm really not feeling good, Tim. Over." "I will, sweetheart, I promise. Over." The crackling sound cut off. There was a moment of silence, and then Granddad sighed. He looked weary, but any sign of the previous tension in his face had gone. "Right, come in then," he said. "You can use my phone, but you'd better make it quick. My grandson's not well either." He edged back away from the door. A moment later, the man stepped into the lounge. Any residual fear I may have felt vanished the minute I saw him. He was about half the size of Granddad. What was left of his thinning black hair was slicked down against his forehead from the rain. He wore glasses that were speckled with water drops. His raincoat dripped onto the carpet.
If you found it engaging, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this.